Sarah.
Melissa,
What are we doing today?
we are recapping some shared reads from 2023.
Sarah, we are in the final days of 2023. Have you met your reading goals for this year?
I really have. I'm actually surprised at how much I read this year. Now, I haven't sat down and made a list, but I feel like I'm going to in the next couple of days. And I was actually, because I have conversations with myself all the time when I'm like driving in my car, and it's just like I don't know if it's an only child thing, but yeah, I do it. I've always been doing it since I was a kid. But I was saying, like, I wonder if it was 24. It could have been 24 books this year. I was like, well, maybe it's at least close to 20 if it's not the full 24. So, yeah, I definitely exceeded, because I just wanted to read books this year because, since I had William back in 2019, I really just, it came to like a grinding halt. Like whatever kind of book reading kind of, I don't know, flow I was on really stopped because, you have a newborn, and then you have a infant, and then you have a toddler, and there's not a lot of time in the day for you to be just like luxuriating in like books. And so I read a bunch of books last year, but then 2023 was like a real banner year. So I read more books this year than I've read in the last probably at least 4 years combined.
Wow.
Maybe even 5. And I hit the goal.
It's so funny when you said about luxuriating in books. And this is something that I totally can relate to, but yet it troubles me because it's like, sometimes I think that I'm like, oh, am I just indulging? Like if I'm sitting reading, is this indulgent? It shouldn't be. It's so good for us, right? It's like,
It is.
it's exercise for the brain. It's making us compassionate. Like it's no secret how great reading is for people. And yet if I am sort of, I kind of sometimes feel like a bit of mom guilt if I'm reading for longer than, an hour or so. It feels like, oh, I'm really indulging. I shouldn't feel that way.
And I've always found when I read, time goes by super fast. And so even if you give yourself okay, I can read for an hour, and then you think, oh, this went too fast. And I'm so interested and engaged in what I'm reading. I want to read more, but I literally can't. I have to make dinner, or I have to play with my child, or, get them ready for bed. So yeah, for me, I'm blessed with a really engaged and involved mother-in-law who takes my son for overnights, probably every 3-4 weeks. And so I really will get a lot of reading done, and road trips too. The last 2 years I've gone on long road trips, and my husband gets motion sickness, so he does all the driving. So then I'm, days on end sitting in a car and reading.
Yeah, I feel like my like reading comes in fits and spurts a little bit. And this year I kind of like got my groove back. And I think we'll end up talking about that because a lot of the books that we're going to talk about today are what sort of put me back on that momentum. And I have also kind of taken more to like audiobooks than I ever have before, different formats, graphic novels, like just trying to kind of switch it up. So one of the things that definitely got me reading again was our grad school reunion, which I would say you're a big part of, but that is like such an understatement. So for our listeners' benefit, as a bit of background, Sarah was the mobilizer to get our grad class together after 15 years. We are so indebted to her for this because you are the force that got us together, and we're all so grateful for it. So do you want to like talk a little bit about how that all came to be?
Certainly. So back in 2007 and 2008, you and I, as well as your husband, Tom, and there was a total of 11 of us, I think, in our program, were in a master's program at Memorial University of Newfoundland, studying English literature. We had a real tight-knit group. And I think for those of us, you, me, Tom, and then several of our other classmates who were not from Newfoundland or not from St. John's, which was the city we were studying in, I feel like we kind of just made like a little bit of a found family for that year plus that we were all together. And, I think we've all kind of maintained relationships, to greater or lesser degrees with one another over these last, 15 years. But I have been thinking for a while, like I would love to get back together with this group of people because it was such a formative experience. It was for me the peak of my time living in Newfoundland, living in St. John's, because I had done part of my undergrad degree up there. And then, of course, this master's degree. Yeah, when the 10-year rolled around, that was the summer I was pregnant with my son, and it just wasn't going to happen. And then obviously I was kind of a bit of a disaster for the first, year plus of having him. And then COVID shut everything down. So there was really no possibility of getting together. And I think during COVID, we had all kind of connected a little bit through Facebook, social media. I said, hey, 2023 is going to be 15 years since the summer that we were all together studying in this program. Let's make a goal. Let's try to get together. And I had really wanted to go to Newfoundland anyway. So it was really kind of selfish on my part. I thought, well, I want to go there. I want to bring my son because I have family there. And it is such an important place for my whole life, from childhood all the way through adulthood. And I wanted to bring him there. And I thought, well, what better excuse if I'm going to go than to kind of get the gang back together. And I really pushed it. And you and I had a inside joke about the movie Mean Girls and this idea that I was was it Gretchen Wieners trying to make fetch happen? And that fetch was this this reunion. And I was really pushing it. And everybody was kind of fetch is not a thing, Sarah. But
fetch was a thing. Fetch was a thing.
Yeah. So there's out of the 11 of us, there was a total of 7 that ultimately got together, which I feel like is pretty good for considering that we're all scattered, throughout kind of, for me, the United States and Atlantic Canada, even out, into the middle of Canada and West Coast. So the fact that we got 7 of us together in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is not an easy place to get to. I really view it as a success. And it was the peak of my year. It was the highlight of my year was that long weekend that we all spent together back on our old stomping grounds.
Yeah, it really was something special. Absolutely. I think back to that time, the original crew being together, 2007, 2008. And I think for a lot of us, it was oh, wow, we found our people, right? The people who get the same jokes, who are just nerds about the same thing, right? It was
yeah.
I find it really funny to think that was only 1 year, right?
I know.
Less than 1 full calendar year. And the bonds that we made, I mean, obviously, Tom and I are married. We're very close. We've really been keeping in contact. But at the same time, 15 years later, we sat in Sun Sushi, one of our favorite restaurants on Duckworth, and it was no time had passed at all. And, then to look behind us and here's the table of our kids eating together. And it was just I can't describe how great it was. One of our courses that we all happened to take together was in Canadian fiction, taught by the epic Dr. Larry Matthews.
Shout out to Larry.
We should have
he's
him
definitely
as a
listening
guest.
to this.
That's right. He'd be so proud of us. Actually, I genuinely think he would be proud of us to know that we're still doing talking about this kind of stuff. And so we were all reading Canadian fiction in this seminar room and talking about the work, and then how we went back in that same room and even kind of sat in our own spots where we used to sit in that class and talked about This Is How We Love by Lisa Moore. We went back to her work to do, and bless her heart, she's still kind. She found Tom and I a babysitter for while we were out there.
I know. Yeah. And talk about full circle. I love a full circle moment. And this idea that, yeah, we read her work back in 2007, met her that same year and got to have her in this seminar, graduate seminar room. And then, yeah, it was kind of one of the things when, this idea of having a reunion, what's the structure going to be? What are we going to do? I mean, certainly there were things that we liked to do, whether it was going to Sun Sushi or going to have drinks downtown, and which we did that as well. But I think for all of us, where we all first met and had this and established this connection with one another was sitting in that graduate seminar room. And what better way to kind of celebrate like where we came from than to revisit an author that we first encountered, 15 years before, and then read one of her latest works and talk about it. And that's what we did. And it was so beautiful. Like I was like a basket case for the entire weekend that we were together. But even like it was really lovely, and like it brought tears to my eyes, like just sitting and looking around this table of all these faces and the conversation that we were able to have. And I really feel like it was that moment that made this podcast a reality, because I think from, revisiting this experience of reading a piece of literature and then talking about it and interpreting it, it brought it all back, and how much we love to do that. And for you and I to be able to kind of continue that and read new works and have conversations and is really great. So, the structure of kind of what we're going to do today is we're going to look at 4 different books that you and I read together this year, really, I mean, over the course of like August through November. But, normally with this, one of us will read and the other kind of asks questions and is the kind of audience surrogate. But we thought it would be cool for today for us to kind of just look back and, talk about books that we both read and I think both loved. Without further ado, let's really talk about this book that we read of Lisa Moore's This Is How We Love. I am going to provide just a little kind of summary, and this is on the book jacket. As the snowstorm of the century rages toward Newfoundland, Canada, 21-year-old Xavier is beaten and stabbed in a vicious attack. His mother, Jules, must fight her way through the shuttered streets of St. John's to reach the hospital where Xavier lies unconscious. When a video of the attack surfaces, Jules struggles to make sense of what she sees in the footage and of what she can't quite make out. While Xavier's story unfolds, so too do the stories that brought him there. Here, across families and generations, are stories of mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers, of children cared for, neglected, lost, and refound, of selfless generosity and reluctant debt. And obviously that's in the book jacket, but that is such a lovely summary of what this book is about. And, I feel like I'm going to run the risk of sounding like a broken record when we when we record these episodes, because, I've said it in the last one when we talked about Hidden Sea. Anytime a book deals with the parent-child relationship, like it just automatically brings me back to kind of my own relationship with being a parent and raising a child. And there were so many moments in this book and so many different types of kind of nurturing parent-child, or even, non-parent child, but people who are there as mentors and people there to guide, and how that love is shown. And it's not necessarily shown through hugs and kisses or words of affirmation, but just shown by being a backbone, or, just physically being there for someone.
I think about the group of people, our grad class, sat around talking about this book. And when we were younger, obviously a lot of our instructors, our professors and mentors at that time would have been parents, caregivers in various ways. And we had been given this book at that time. I wonder what sorts of things that we would have said about it. And then when we sat around the table this summer, all of us were parents, right? And just to think of, the wisdom that comes with parenthood, but also just with time, right? That's not to diminish like different forms of knowledge that just come from being an adult and being in various relationships. But I couldn't help but think about what we would have said about this book before we were parents. And you're absolutely right. Like I really loved the closing scene of this book, which I'm not going to describe because that would, to be honest, yeah. And I think in isolation, the ending is not as powerful as it is unless you read it as a culmination of the book. And I loved this story being told to me, and it was told. I say it being told to me because I actually did listen to this one, as you know, as an audiobook. I live on the island of Newfoundland. I live on the West Coast. St. John's is on the East Coast. Luckily, 8-hour drive, 8-hour
Perfect.
audio book.
Yeah.
So we sort of crammed this, which seemed very appropriate given how I crammed most of everything for grad school. So yeah, we just played it from Corner Brook right to St. John's. That final scene, having it told to me, it was just, the payoff was beautiful. And I'm usually not a big fan of just, sort of putting all the emphasis on the last, like, how does it end? About me, it's about everything that comes in between. I said earlier, she's a master of the craft, and she just keeps getting better. Like this,
Yeah.
I think I've read all of her novels and most of her like published short stories, like the various collections and so on. And I think this is she's just getting better all the time.
For me to pick this book up after many years of not reading her, I was like, oh, that's right. Yeah, she really, this craft of hers, like just so beautifully written. And it's funny, you talk about cramming, and you were cramming the audiobook, but so likewise, I was driving across the island because I took a ferry from Nova Scotia over to Newfoundland and got off on the West Coast and had to drive all the way across, which was about a 9-hour drive. And I read the book in during the 1-day drive that we took. There was one point, and I don't remember what part of Newfoundland, not that anybody cares, but what part of Newfoundland I was in. But I read this part, and it, again, through the context of my own relationship with parenthood, I started just crying. And I had to look out the window and just kind of brush my tears away, because I was just like, oh, the act of being a parent and knowing that you have to let go of things, at some point, that the relationship that you have with your small child is not the relationship you're going to have with your grown child. And so I just have this short excerpt I'm going to read. So this is Jules, who is the mother to Xavier, who had this horrific attack, was in the hospital, and he is unconscious. He has an infection. He's had to have surgery. The storm is raging outside. I mean, you think such a fraught moment as a human, never mind a mother. And so Jules is in Xavier's hospital room, and he's going to be wheeled in so that they can, give him a scan, a CT scan. This is Jules. And she said, they said I could go with him. The hallway in the basement was freezing. One of Xavier's hands lay loosely on the outside of the bedsheet. I inched my hand under his so it cupped mine. It was a funny thing to touch the hand of my unconscious son. His hand was very warm. His face was warm too. I put the back of my hand against his cheek. I wouldn't do it if he were awake. Mothers and grown sons don't hold hands. At the end of each phone call, we say, I love you. Or if he comes over for a visit, he's only a few streets away. He comes over and borrows stuff, sugar, a pair of clean socks. He lets me study his face when he's telling a story. He doesn't turn away. Even before this happened, I couldn't get enough of his face. Sometimes when he's telling me a story, he's ambushed by giggles, and he has to chuff out parts of sentences, and he shuts his eyes when the laughter takes over. And then he gets a hold of himself and continues with the story. That, I don't know, that just the idea of her holding her son's hand as he's laying unconscious. And it's this act that she would never do if he were, if he were awake and healthy and conscious, because it's just not something that she can do anymore. And that just killed me. It was just so beautifully rendered, that moment. And I feel and there's so many different parts of this book that have that feeling to them when you're reading. I would say, at the very least, this is a should read. It's just a beautiful expression of the relationships that we have in our lives and the many forms that love takes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've even found that phrase, that this is how we love, that phrase comes to mind for me. In different moments of my life, I'll be like, this is how we love. That's how it will help me kind of make sense of a moment that I'm in. So no, I agree with you. Beautiful book. And it did such beautiful things for us as a group of friends and classmates. The next one.
Ducks. as we were in St. John's during this reunion, the first part of it was just our two families, and we went to the Geo Center. But as we were in the gift shop, you pointed this book out to me, Ducks by Kate Beaton. You said you should get this book. I don't know if you've read any kind of graphic novels before. And you had said, I hadn't either before I read this, and I couldn't put it down. I loved it. And you strongly recommended it. And so I said, well, of course, I value your your recommendations and your opinion. And so I picked it up. But Melissa, you want to tell us a little bit about Ducks?
I do. And I will pick up on your anecdote a little bit too, because we did have a laugh about this, that this book was very hard to come by when it was first kind of like hitting the scene, because it was in high demand. Like everybody wanted to read this book. So not only did I see it in the gift shop, but I'm sorry to Kate Beaton, who is also a master of many crafts here. It was on the discount table. I was like, what in the world is happening? Like this author, this artist is like at the pinnacle of her career. Well, I shouldn't say that. She may soar after this. I'm sure she will. But I was like, why is this on the discount table? And you and I kind of exchanged a knowing glance. And then in the parking lot, we're like, yeah, because probably they were like, oh, book about oil and gas. That's right up our alley. And then someone read it and was like, whoa. We got to get rid of these books. I don't know how to fully encapsulate what this book is about, because it illustrates so many themes so well. I think this book is a perfect way to share the complexities and the importance of, well, everything from the environmental crisis, early womanhood in the early millennium in particular. I think it also really captures the economic realities of rural communities, especially in Atlantic Canada. I think it does illustrate some male experiences from our parents' generations in a very important way as well. It tells the story of the impact of debt associated with education and the discrepancy between the value we place on education and the types of employment where immediate income is available. I absolutely loved this book. So because it was really hard to get a hold of when it was initially released, and I borrowed a copy from a friend, and when we were getting ready for this recording, I picked one up from the library. I am not exaggerating that when I opened this book, and this was maybe 6 months later, when I opened this book and saw the images, my body reacted. Like I had a visceral reaction. The first page it's a map of Canada. And I immediately responded to the aesthetic of her work, like the style. And it just immediately brought me back to so many points in this book. So I have to say, like, and I don't want to get into this in any way, but I don't know Kate Beaton. I feel like I know Kate Beaton, but people who are close to her in her life are also close to me in my life. There are people in this book who I've met and know well and am very, very fond of. So I felt connected to the book. I guess in a way I felt initially obligated to read the book, right? These people in my world were connected to this book. And I'm not a graphic novel person. Like I think I've read a graphic novel version of Sense and Sensibility once. Like that was it. I have so much respect for this format now, and just how I felt like I was in this with them. These are women my own age at a time I remember very fondly, or I should say that I remember very vividly in my own life. And I really felt like this new format to me, this graphic novel style of writing, was such a significant way to bring the reader into the experience. And I thought it was amazing. And I'm so glad that you liked it too.
Oh, yeah. I loved it. And to see the images, to see the expression, the way she captures different people's expressions when there's, when there's something going on. I got sucked in. I read it so quickly. I mean, of course, with all of the illustrations, that go along with a graphic novel, it's meaty, it's big. And I thought, oh, I wonder how long it'll take me to read this. And it took me no time at all. One of my best friends, after we finished undergrad, went out to Alberta and she worked for a year. I think it was like 21 days on 8 days off or something like that. And they would fly her back and forth. And so, I think it was financially a really great opportunity for her. But I do recall how exhausted she was. But I don't know what her full experience was. And when I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of her because this was in the same time frame, like 2005, 2006. And just thinking about that. And of course, like in Atlantic Canada, like especially Cape Breton, especially Newfoundland, you have a lot of workers who were displaced out of their chosen fields that generations of families had worked in, and suddenly there are no jobs to be had. And so you have a lot of older workers leaving their homes, leaving their families, and going out in these kind of makeshift towns and working nonstop in dangerous environments. And, kind of the pressure cooker of this idea of it being what I don't even know what the ratio, because I know they talk about it in the book, but it's like 95% male to like 5% female. Some of the fallout from that and how unnatural these environments are for people to be living and working in. And what I love about ducks is I feel like you could have no prior knowledge and she breaks it down, even just showing the map of Canada and, in the different chapters, showing kind of the cast of people and where they're from. And it really sets it up so that you can engage with this book, not having any connection to the people or the places, but really understand and really make a connection.
When I was trying to list like what are the themes of this book, I was like, man, how did she do all that? And I think it's partly because the format, if you had asked me before I read this book, I think I would have assumed that graphic novels would be very superficial, right? Like they could only kind of express a bit of dialogue and you could never really get that inner world of a narrator. But I actually think it's the opposite in this case, that her ability to show the spaces and the environments and the interactions is what allows her to give us more story than I ever thought would be possible. And I think those two things are kind of something that I could show in a passage here. And to be fair, it's difficult to read a passage from a graphic novel, I think, but I'll just read the dialogue. I'll try to pause between the two speakers. I think you really have to live in this type of camp communal living to understand it. Right. And so this is, an early sort of notion of someone sort of saying, until you're there, you don't really know. The character Kate, so this is an autobiography. I assume that she would go with that that categorization of the book. But
yeah, because I mean, in the illustration that show, it's like Kate Beaton, like
she's like, I'm me.
It really is. This is my story.
This is about as autobiographical as it gets, I suppose, now that I think about it. So she says, so she's working in Alberta, but she's not working in a camp yet. I think she's actually working a couple jobs, like a waitress somewhere. And then she has this position where she can commute in and commute out of a work, a work site, we'll say. So she's traveling with a male character. I don't actually remember who this male character is. I think someone around her dad's age. So it's just her and him in the car and they're heading up to work. And she says, I just got a job offer at Long Lake, actually, in the camps. I see. I applied last fall. Should I take it? Well, if it's the money you're looking for, it'll be there. But what's the work camp like? I'm picturing like tents. Tents? Haha. It's just room and board, nothing like camping. It's not fancy, but it's not tense. Is it safe? Safe as anywhere, I suppose. Out there, you don't come home to regular life every night like here. That changes a person. There's not so much to hold on to. Keep your head straight. Find your people. This, to me, like going back to it, this is really setting the scene of like, they sort of enter into this kind of, I don't want to say confined, but I think there is this kind of feeling of confinement amongst this set of people, right? So, and a set of people who may not be diverse in sort of, they're not ethnically diverse necessarily. In many ways, they're actually a very monochromatic sort of group of people who actually come from like a fairly similar, probably like cultural and even economic or socioeconomic background. And yet they dig into like, people are there for different reasons. People react to this environment in different ways. And I think like you were saying, we all have so many connections to people who do this type of work that suddenly we were all kind of more curious about what is this like? What toll is this taking on this person, or has this taken on this person? So I 100% give this book a must read. This
I
is
do
a
too.
must read.
I'm with you.
And there were moments reading this book. I never went out west. I didn't do the type of work ever, but the way that it portrays life in the early 2000s as a young woman, it is completely accurate. It actually like helped me in some ways like understand what my own early womanhood at that time was like. School
Yeah.
curriculum, it should be.
Yeah.
The next one we're going to talk about, I'm really feeling a little guilty here because I feel like I recommended all these books, and
That's okay.
what books did Melissa read that Sarah suggested? None. Okay, the next book is Monica Heisey's Really Good Actually. And I bought this while we were in St. John's and read it on the drive home. And I want to know, are you glad I recommended this book to you?
Yes. It's funny because we're really going kind of chronologically as to like when we read these books. Because for me, I read This Is How We Love, and then I had bought Ducks while we were in St. John's, read it after I got home. And then when you suggested Really Good Actually, I was like, I'm on a roll. Why not? I'm gonna see if I can get. So I requested it from the library. So Monica Heisey, she's another Canadian writer. And I think noteworthy, if we're thinking about like the tone of this book, she was a writer for Schitt's Creek and for Working Moms, which was a Netflix show. And so that really kind of sets the scene for the kind of writer she is in this book. And within, I would say, the first chapter, I literally was laughing out loud. And I never laugh out loud reading a book. Never. Like I might kind of like have a little like smirk on my face as I'm reading. Maybe like a little like sniff if I find something funny. But I had to stop reading. I laughed so hard I started crying, and William was in the room with me. He was watching TV, and he looked and he was like, he started laughing because I was laughing so hard, and he was like, "Mama's crying. She's laughing so hard." That happened actually more than once reading this book. And so I was very happy that you recommended it to me because I really dug this book. And so I'll just give like, again, a little bit of a synopsis or at least a little preview of what it's about. Maggie is fine. She's doing really good, actually. Sure, she's broke. Her graduate thesis on something obscure is going nowhere, and her marriage lasted only 608 days. But at the ripe old age of 29, Maggie is determined to embrace her new life as a trademark, surprisingly young divorcee. Now she has time to take up 9 hobbies, eat hamburgers at 4 a.m., and quote unquote get back out there, sex wise. With the support of her tough loving academics advisor, Maris, her newly divorced friend, Amy, and her group chat, naturally, Maggie barrels through her first year of single life, intermittently dating, occasionally waking up on the floor, and asking herself tough questions along the way. So yeah, Maggie, we open it up and she's detailing like, okay, this is why my marriage broke up. And she starts listing all of these reasons. And I think anyone who's been in a long-term relationship can kind of, at least on some level, relate to the little nitpicky things that we will find with our significant others. But she kind of details like what ended up making this breakup happen. And then the entire book after that is basically her kind of struggling using kind of the crutches of social media and dating apps and her friend group to, try to get through. And it's funny, when I really like a book, a lot of times I'll go and I'll read a bunch of reviews. I'll try to find as many reviews as possible to see if people agree with, my take on the book. And a lot of the reviews started off saying like that this was kind of like similar to like a Bridget Jones's Diary, which I kind of took issue with. I was like, I mean, and I'm not. There's nothing against Bridget Jones's Diary. I mean, certainly there's like she's fumbling and she's trying to figure it out. It's a comedy, she's herself like a mess, and it's there's a romantic element to it, kind of being broken up with or going through a breakup and then kind of figuring it out from there. But I didn't when I think of Bridget Jones's Diary, I think of like this kind of love triangle, and that like ultimately like
Oh,
she succeeds at the end of that story because she finds the right guy. Because I found that this book was less about her succeeding romantically than her really being alone with herself and really having to face that for the first time in her adult life.
and I loved the Bridget Jones series as like a
Mm,
teenager. So there was a bit
right.
of nostalgia for me. And again, like I said, coming out of a dry spell of not reading for a while. And I was kind of feeling this connection to like the version of myself that first really fell in love with reading and that kind of like page turner
Mm,
experience. But I almost take it as this is an updated version of like,
mm,
Bridget Jones, because in the 90s, yeah, the success, the happily ever after, I think people were still very much expecting, and then she falls in love, and then
mm.
she lives with the man of her dreams, whereas I think that this was the opposite of that, deliberately, to be like, well, no, she learns how to live with herself, and I appreciated that kind of that modern take on it, that sort of updated version.
I can see that. Yeah. I related to her on levels that like I probably shouldn't admit, like because she's such a messy person and can be really selfish and imperfect and make bad decisions. And she really, I mean, through a good chunk of the book, she's just making one bad decision after
Mhm.
another. I mean, and she can be an unreliable narrator at times because there are things that she says that she's not doing, or things that she omits that later on come out that she maybe did or didn't do in a certain way. And so I found it refreshing to have someone that was such a mess. Like, and I keep saying the word mess because that's all I can think of when I think of this book is like life is messy. Being a 29-year-old and newly single since you were in a relationship with someone from like age 19 on, and this new kind of landscape of dating and relationships and self-care and social media, and like how all of that plays on your insecurities and how you can distract yourself from working on yourself and being a good person. There's one part I just want it's within the first chapter. That first chapter really deals with how her marriage kind of fell apart and the kind of the first days after this breakup when her now estranged husband has left their apartment and she's by herself. Uh that she had, sometimes would wake up in the middle of the night and have from dreams that he was still there, and then, realize that she was by herself. And she says, when this happened, I felt in order, stupid, sad, disappointed, vindicated when I remembered something similar had happened to Joan Didion in the year of magical thinking. Embarrassed again that I'd grasped at this connection to Joan Didion, quietly proud, like maybe there were some similarities, then more sad and eventually tired. But I was not an incredibly chic voice of a generation who had lost her life's love. I could not even figure out the new pant shape, and my greatest work was an incomplete PhD dissertation about the lived history of objects in early modern theater. Even when it was finished, no one would read it. I hadn't lost my husband, I had left him, or rather, I had suggested he leave, and he had taken me up on this incredibly quickly. In many ways, it seemed like the last thing we had agreed upon. I don't know. I just like I love that tone of her like, oh, well, Joan Didion, like we have something in common. And then her being like, what? Like, I'm not Joan Didion. Like, I'm I'm kind of a failed academic at this point. And then like kind of the back and forth nature of it. But there was one other piece to this later in the same kind of paragraph where she talks about things that she would argue about with her husband before they broke up. And the last she has, it's listed in bullet points. She uses a lot of lists and bullet points throughout this book. But the last bullet point, this is the things that they would argue about. She says that one time he called me an adjacent professor by accident. And it was completely innocent, the word being truly very close to adjunct. But because I was already so hurt all the time, I took it as a slight about my lack of professional seniority. And because I was hungry and exhausted and premenstrual, I cried about it in public. And because we were sick of each other, We said snide things we didn't mean and wounded things we did. And the whole thing lasted a full day longer than the 4 or 5 seconds it would have taken to correct him and move on. And I never admitted it was my fault, even later when he apologized. I just love the mining, the little details about maybe her being oversensitive, but then finding humor out of it. Like I do find the adjacent professor.
Which it's such an innocent mistake, right?
It
Like
is.
from this guy's perspective, I think he was in marketing or something,
He
like it
was, yeah.
wouldn't be in his vernacular necessarily.
Yeah.
But I can also understand how she would suddenly feel lesser than, right? And I liked, what did she say? Because I was hurting all the time or something, the way
Yeah,
that
because
she
I was
phrased
already
it.
so hurt. Like, I feel like
Mm,
when you're already in a certain place and somebody says or does something, and it's like kind
mhm.
of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, like you're almost like paranoid.
There's certain behaviors I think that as women, we sort of obsessive behaviors that women engage in. And I do think it's gendered. I know that men have sort of other tendencies in moments of crisis or uncertainty or anxiety. But I felt like this book did talk about a lot of those types of behaviors unapologetically, right? That it wasn't like,
Yes.
and that, like you should feel ashamed if you creep someone on social media. Like, nope, we're all doing it. So just like, it's not something that we should feel embarrassed about. It's kind of like a coping mechanism at this point. Is this a could read, should read, must read for you?
I mean, because I've recommended it to people, so I feel like it's between a should and a must read for me. Um, but I could understand how she could be off-putting. Like for me, I found her refreshing. And like you said, some of the things she does unapologetically, if you look inside yourself, we all can do that too. I'm going to say I should read.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as much as I loved the growth and I loved the person that she became, I was a little dubious of how long she was going to sort of stay on the tracks there.
Yeah.
So the last book we're going to talk about that we both read in 2023 is Hello Beautiful by Ann Napolitano. I got this book because I decided in the summer that I should stop being such a snob about what books I pick and just try to read things that are popular. And I'm kind of like one of those people who's always like I use the example of when I was in like middle school and everybody was into Backstreet Boys. I was like, well, I like a British band called Take That you've probably never heard of, just because I could never be like the mainstream of anything because that was not me.
Oh my
So
God. Yeah.
so I was like, I kept seeing this book pop up and I was like, you know what? I'm not better than everybody else. I can read like just read
Mhm.
the chick lit or whatever the term of the day is. So I got this book and ended up recommending it to you. Full disclosure, also felt a little bit proud of myself for finally reading something that wasn't set in Atlantic Canada. I only read like if 10 out of 10 times if I'm given books that are like if I'm given a Canadian choice or an American choice, I always will pick the Canadian book, especially if it's Atlantic Canada. So I
Of
was
course.
like, okay, you got to branch out a little bit. To give a bit of a summary, I feel like this book was like reading 3 seasons of a soap opera. It mainly follows one family and this other character who marries into the family. Key themes would be like childhood trauma, mental health, loss, marriage, divorce, family conflict, and then sort of complex family ties that still exist even amongst conflict. How we can kind of come back to our family, but then the family is different after absence and that sort of thing. My summary of how I feel about this book is that it was very readable,
Mm.
but somewhat forgettable. So there's only really one section when I went back was like, what was like the image that I got from this book that I kept with me later on? And I did love this idea of people seeing past trauma in people. So William, he's the individual who marries into this family. He's a basketball player. So he had experienced loss. He lost a sibling when he was very young, and his whole family life really crumbled after that. So it was a major influence on his development. But he played a lot of basketball, and in high school he has an injury, but he recovers from the injury and is able to go on and play at the university level. And he ends up developing a relationship eventually with his physiotherapist. And the passage that I'm going to read is when they first start to get to know one another. So they're in the hospital. William has just had this second injury now, because he was injured in high school and now he's been injured in university. The physio, a bearded man named Arash, hung back, though, and approached the hospital bed. He frowned and said, "What was the history with that knee?" William nodded in appreciation of the question. The knee did have a history. The pencil point inside him softened, and he was able to gather enough air to breathe. "I broke the kneecap my junior year in high school during a very similar play, actually." "I thought so." "So the kneecap shattered the way it did because of an earlier weakness." And then later on the page, Arash says, "I saw your weak knee." William leaned forward. "What do you mean you saw my weak knee?" "Arash was a stocky man with powerful looking forearms. You protected it once or twice. I could also see how you used your other side to pivot and jump. That's what happens when an injury occurs at a young age. The knee doesn't operate in isolation. The hip and ankle start to get used differently, and your overall balance is thrown off. There's interplay between the various joints, and no one told you to build the weak leg back to full strength. I bet you came out of the cast last time and immediately returned to the court without changing anything, right?" William nodded. "That's what I thought." And I just really appreciate how visual that is, right? Like
Mm,
we can picture a person walking and we know what a person looks like if they limp, but then trying to apply that to mental health too. Like if we could see people's past traumas, past
mm,
emotional traumas in the way that we can see physical injury, and then looking at how their coping mechanisms to deal with those emotional traumas, if we could see those and then see how they develop into further injuries and further injuries, I really appreciated that way of explaining what is, a universal kind of sentiment about like, don't judge people. You don't know what they've been through. You can't walk in their shoes until you realize.
mm. Yeah, and with that particular character, William, like that is such an important moment for him because that ultimately has such an impact on his trajectory as a character and what he ends up kind of doing with his life. Because this book, it spans a quite a, from the early 80s, really when we're kind of introduced to William when he's starting college, and Julia, who is the girl that he marries into her family, and it goes all the way into like the early 2000s, I believe.
I think so.
um and so you really get to see these characters grow from, young 18, some of the characters are even younger, all the way up into kind of middle age. William is a very wounded person, not just this knee injury, but I mean, as you had said before about this trauma that he experienced as a child. And it's something that he really carries with him and has such an impact on how he's able to relate to other people and to be able to achieve happiness. One thing that I found interesting about this book, and when you and I were first talking about it before I started reading it, is you had mentioned that very loosely, and it is quite loose, that there's like kind of almost like a Little Women kind of like, not homage, but kind of like the family is four
Mm,
sisters, and they each have very distinct kind of personalities, and their father is a bit of a dreamer and a poet and not a very practical person, and their mother is uber practical. Little Women is a book that I studied a lot in undergrad and wrote papers on, and yeah, it was a part of it, but it wasn't like a direct, "This is Little Women, but told in modern times." Like, because there were
mm,
parts of the book where I completely forgot about that, the similarities between, the 4 sisters and the dreamy father and the practical mother and all of that, and it was something different. One of the things that struck me was the descriptions of how close the sisters were, because 2 of the sisters, Julia and Sylvie, they're depicted as they shared a room all growing up. In their early adulthood, Sylvie would come over routinely and kind of sleep on the couch with her sister, and they would be like intertwined with one another. And there was something, the way that that was written about this the closeness of family. And a lot of times the sisters, when they're kind of described, it's like they're almost like different faces of the same person. Like they look so similar to one another. And there was something about that it struck me, and it really, I don't have a sister. I don't, I'm not, I don't, I don't have a sibling, period. And there was something about that that I just kept kind of going back to and thinking about that. I really liked how that was rendered in the book.
Yeah, there was definitely some valuable family
Mm.
imagery, but I did find it too idyllic sometimes. Like, I mean, I do have a sister. There's more jealousy, there's more cattiness than I think, especially when they're that close in age and there's that many of them and they lived in a pretty like a
Yeah.
smallish house. I felt like kind of they were almost too forgiving with each other. And I'm blanking a little bit because like I said, like it's almost like if you watched like The Young and the Restless, it's sort of like this two families and just the generations
Yeah.
through and everyone's sort of intertwined and you're kind of like, was that this sister or was that their neighbor? Like it all just kind of
Mm.
blended in. So like this is not a book that I'll recall later in life, I don't think. And
Mm.
which is partly why I'm so surprised it has gotten every time I open up like the Indigo website, it's like this is the book of the year. I've been a little bit surprised at how much it's gotten. And I think there's something to the, not to sound too cynical here, but I mean, it's a machine, it's an industry, right? Like you and I were
Mm.
talking about, Lisa Moore's book is just mastercraft. The publishing house doesn't have the same influence. Maybe I don't really know that much about either of their publishers, but it's just like, to me, that's a far superior book, but maybe with less of a marketing engine behind it.
Mm. You mentioned that I think you said it was readable, but it wasn't memorable. But I think that's sometimes what it's all about. Is this a readable book? Is this something that you can get
Mm,
through and you can get through pretty quickly? And yeah, I would also agree that some of the characters are not rendered as finely. Like I feel like you get to know a few of the characters very well, and then some of them are just kind of like they do kind of blend into one another. Like two of the sisters are kind of like one's an artist and one's like a early childhood, kind of
right.
educator, but, like, there's even kind of some stereotypes that they end up, like, kind of being in and they're not more than their stereotype, if that makes sense?
It
Like
totally makes
yeah,
sense. Yeah.
yeah.
This is gonna sound really horrible, and I don't think I fully mean it, but it's a little bit like you could ask AI to generate because they're also kind of like so based
Mhm.
on Little Women too, which is not a book I'm particularly familiar with, but like they're like you said, they're kind of four stock characters who happen to be sisters, and it's a little bit, yeah, it's kind of a mild book. I feel like I won't get a could read because I feel like a could read for me has got to be a real stinker, like one that I'm like, oh, I've wasted my time. I did
Mhm.
not feel like I wasted my time. I felt like I had a great readerly sort of walk through this book. A loose should reads the most generous I could go with it. What about you?
Hmm. I would say a could read. 'Cause
Yeah.
I'm not it's to me, like, it doesn't have to be a stinker to be a could read. It can just be an okay book, like an
Right.
okay book.
Sarah, I'm so pleased that throughout 2023, we not only got to see one another, reconnect with one another at our reunion and through the podcast.
Me too. Me too. And I can't wait to see what books we each read as individuals in 2024 and some that we have kind of overlapping. And I wish you a happy new year.
Happy New Year.